Imagine this: a seemingly average day takes a shocking turn when a young black boy, no more than 15 years old, is forced into a nightmare scenario. His heart races as a police officer, fueled by nothing but pure authority, orders him to bite down on a rat. The boy's stomach churns in horror. This isn't some twisted game or a bizarre form of punishment. It's a cruel display of power, one that will forever change the course of his life. But here's the twist that no one saw coming: this boy's father, unbeknownst to the officer and even to the boy himself, is a highly trained FBI agent. A man who's seen it all, dealt with criminals and threats that most of us could never imagine. This officer, in his blind arrogance, has no idea that he's just crossed a line that could have life-shattering consequences for him and everyone involved. What starts as a routine day in the life of an officer quickly spirals into an unbelievable situation. The tension in the air is thick, with a feeling of dread creeping in. The boy, barely holding it together, can't understand why this is happening to him. He's just a kid, caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time, yet what's happening to him now could ripple out, affecting much more than he ever thought possible. This isn't just about one kid and one officer. It's about systemic issues, power dynamics, and the unseen forces at play in our society. It's about the struggle for dignity, respect, and justice. The boy's father, his sense of duty, and his protection instinct are now called into question. How far will he go to get his son back? How far will this officer go before realizing the storm he's about to unleash? As the boy stares down at the rat, feeling trapped in a nightmare of humiliation and fear, the clock is ticking. His father is out there, unaware of what's happening to his son. The officer, focused solely on his own sense of control, doesn't realize that the truth he's about to uncover is bigger than he ever imagined. And the worst part? He doesn't even see it coming. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything for everyone involved. The power of one man's determination, the tragic misunderstanding, and the shocking reveal that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. You won't believe how this story unfolds. So, who's really in control? And who will be left standing when the dust settles? The air crackles with tension. The boy stands frozen, his mind racing, his heart pounding against his chest as the officer looms over him. He can barely comprehend what's happening, everything feels surreal, like a nightmare he can't wake up from. This is not just a regular day for him. This is not some typical encounter with the police. It's something much darker, something he never imagined he would face. He can see the rat, twitching in the officer's hands. It's formatted and dirty. The officer's eyes are cold, devoid of empathy, and his words are like a command from a world the boy didn't know existed. The boy's body trembles, fighting against the fear that grips him. His mind is screaming for him to run, to escape, but he knows he's trapped. There's no way out. The officer's voice is unyielding as he orders him again, forcing him to confront a grotesque reality. But little does the officer know, the young boy is not alone in this story. The boy's father is a shadow behind the scenes, a protector whose reach extends far beyond what this officer could ever understand. This is not just a random encounter, it's the beginning of something far more dangerous than either party realizes. The boy, unaware of the identity of the man who just forced him into this situation, has one thing the officer doesn't: a father who is not your average person. The boy's father, a man who has spent his life serving justice in ways this officer never could. A man who, unbeknownst to the officer, holds a position that could bring everything crashing down. The officer, too consumed by his ego and his position of power, doesn't know that he's standing on the edge of a cliff. One false step, one crossing of a line, and he will unleash consequences far beyond what he could ever have imagined. It's not just about the rat. It's not just about humiliating a kid. This is about something much deeper: the way power is abused, the fragile line between right and wrong, and how quickly everything can unravel. The boy's thoughts are a whirlwind of confusion. How could this be happening to him? What did he do wrong? What kind of world does he live in, where his worth can be dictated by someone else's will, where his humanity can be reduced to nothing more than a tool for someone else's twisted version of justice? He can feel the weight of the officer's gaze, his authority looming over him, making him feel smaller with every passing second. But then there's that nagging thought, that one thought that refuses to leave his mind: his father. What would his father say about this? Would his father even know how to handle this? The boy doesn't know what his father does, not really, not in the way he should. But deep down, in some corner of his mind, the boy knows his father is someone who would never let something like this go. The boy doesn't know it yet, but his father's world, one of intelligence, danger, and authority, is about to collide with the officer's in a way that neither man will see coming. The officer thinks he has control, but the boy's father is a force to be reckoned with, a person who knows how to navigate through shadows, how to use power in ways that no one else can. It's a world of surveillance, secrets, and unspoken rules, a world where consequences are swift and unforgiving. The officer, blinded by his own sense of power, is about to step into that world, a world where his every move will be watched, analyzed, and judged. The tension in the air thickens as the boy's thoughts turn from fear to something darker. He knows his father will come for him. But how? What will happen when this seemingly ordinary officer finds himself face to face with someone who operates in a world of authority he could never understand? The rat is still there, its beady eyes staring back at him. He shudders as he tries to hold himself together, wishing more than anything that this was just a bad dream. But in the pit of his stomach, he knows it's real. His heart aches with the knowledge that the man standing over him doesn't care, doesn't see him for who he truly is. To the officer, he's just another target, another person to control, to dominate, to break. But the boy is more than that. He is someone's son. He is someone's world. And his father, the one person who could truly change everything, is out there, unknowingly heading into a storm of his own. The officer may think he's in control now, but the boy's father will make sure that power shifts. The question isn't if things will change, but when. As the boy is forced to make a choice that could haunt him forever, he wonders if this is the moment that everything he's ever known will be shattered. Will the officer get away with this? Will he ever face the consequences for his actions? Or will the boy's father be able to bring justice in a way the officer never expected? The answers are closer than anyone thinks, but they remain just out of reach. The world as they know it is about to turn upside down. The officer doesn't realize that the real reckoning is yet to come, and it will come fast, with a force that will change everything for both men. What happens next will leave everyone reeling, and the consequences of this one moment will ripple through their lives in ways no one could ever anticipate. The officer has no idea what's coming. And the boy? He's just trying to survive long enough to see his father again. The boy, whose name is Marcus, never imagined his life would take such a dark turn. He grew up in a small, tight-knit community, a place where everyone knew everyone else, where neighbors watched each other's backs, and kids played in the streets without fear. His father, though distant at times, had always been his rock. He knew his father's job was important, that he was involved in work that kept the country safe, but Marcus never fully understood the gravity of it. He would hear his father on the phone late at night, speaking in hushed tones, using terms and phrases that seemed far beyond Marcus' understanding. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was always with authority, always with the kind of confidence that made people listen. Marcus didn't care much about those details growing up. He was just a kid, navigating the world like anyone else. He spent his days in school, hanging out with his friends, and dreaming of a future where he could escape his small town and make something of himself. But those dreams felt out of reach now, with the officer's cruel demands looming in his mind. He was only 15, yet his world was crumbling before him, the things he thought he understood about right and wrong slipping away in the face of that officer's twisted power. The officer's name was Officer Taylor. He was one of those people who believed the badge gave him the right to do whatever he wanted, to treat people as if they were nothing more than pawns in his game of authority. His reputation in the precinct was that of a man who didn't take nonsense, a man who believed in maintaining order by any means necessary. Taylor had no patience for those who disrespected him or questioned his authority. He saw himself as a protector of the law, though his methods were often questionable. To him, power wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon to wield, a way to control and intimidate those beneath him. But Officer Taylor had no idea that the boy he was tormenting, the boy who stood trembling before him, was more than just another face in the crowd. He didn't know Marcus' last name, didn't know anything about the boy's family, and certainly didn't know who his father was. Taylor's arrogance blinded him to the potential consequences of his actions. He didn't care to look deeper, to see beyond the boy's frightened face to the reality that Marcus' father was someone who could bring his world crashing down. Marcus' father, Andrew, was a man who had seen it all. He'd worked for the FBI for over a decade, a job that had taken him to the darkest corners of society, a job that required him to navigate a world full of danger and deception. Andrew wasn't the kind of man who talked about his work at home. He never wanted to worry Marcus with the details of his day, and he certainly didn't want his son to get caught up in the violence and secrecy that came with his job. But Andrew was no fool. He knew what the world was like. He knew that the job he did was one of the most dangerous, yet also one of the most vital. He had learned over the years how to protect his family, how to shield them from the threats that could come from any direction. But even Andrew didn't know how dangerous the world could become when a single decision, a single moment, could set off a chain of events that no one could control. He had always believed he could keep his family safe, that he could protect Marcus from the chaos of his work, but today, as Marcus stood alone and terrified, his father was too far away to stop what was happening. Andrew had spent his career battling enemies who were ruthless and cold-hearted, but he had never faced an enemy like Officer Taylor, someone who, despite the badge he wore, was willing to crush the very spirit of a child to prove a point. As Marcus stood there, his mind racing, he wondered how long he could keep his composure. His stomach churned at the thought of the rat, the officer's cruel gaze, and the feeling of helplessness that seemed to consume him. The officer was enjoying this moment. He was enjoying the power he held over the boy, watching as Marcus hesitated, his fear palpable. Taylor believed this was the moment when he would break Marcus, when he would see the fear in the boy's eyes and know that he had won. But what Taylor didn't know was that Marcus had already fought battles of his own, battles he didn't tell anyone about, and there was a strength inside him that wasn't so easily crushed. In that moment, Marcus thought of his father. He thought of the quiet dinners they had shared, of the late-night talks when Andrew would offer advice about life, about standing up for what was right. Marcus wasn't sure if he could summon the strength his father had. He wasn't sure if he could get through this moment, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let Officer Taylor win. He couldn't let this officer take away his dignity. Marcus forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just stand there, waiting for the officer to make the next move. The only thing he had in that moment was his will to survive, his will to resist. He tried to push the image of the rat from his mind, tried to focus on something, anything, that would keep him from falling apart. His thoughts were blurry, but there was one thing he kept coming back to: the look in his father's eyes when he had told Marcus to always stay strong, to always remember that he had the power to control his own destiny. But as the officer loomed closer, Marcus felt his pulse quicken, the suffocating fear tightening its grip. He needed a way out. He needed to survive this, but how? The seconds felt like hours as Taylor glared at him, waiting for the boy to submit, to give in. Marcus wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. In the distance, a car engine revved, but Marcus couldn't tell if it was just another vehicle passing by, or if it was his father, someone who would save him from the nightmare that seemed to be closing in on him. But what if it wasn't? What if it was too late? What if, just like that, everything was taken from him? The answer was closer than Marcus realized. The mystery of his father's work, the secrets he kept hidden, the way his life had always seemed just a little bit off, was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. But that answer would come at a price, one that Marcus might not be prepared to pay. And as the officer's hand tightened on the rat, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything, in that moment, was about to change. But for better or worse? He couldn't know just yet. Marcus' mind was clouded with fear, but beneath that fear was a growing sense of defiance. The officer's looming presence made his skin crawl, but Marcus couldn't let himself break. Not now. He thought about his father, strong, resolute, always in control. Marcus had always admired that about him. Andrew had a way of commanding respect, not just because of his job, but because of who he was. He carried an air of quiet authority that people listened to, and Marcus, despite his confusion and terror in this moment, tried to channel even a small part of that strength. The officer, growing impatient, stepped closer, tightening his grip on the rat. Marcus could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, and it was suffocating. "You're gonna do it, kid," Officer Taylor said coldly, his voice a low growl. "Don't make me repeat myself." Marcus' eyes darted around, searching for any way out. His pulse pounded in his ears as his thoughts swirled, disjointed and frantic. The walls seemed to close in around him. He was trapped. But in the haze of fear, a thought broke through, a sharp, clear thought, don't give him the satisfaction. Don't let him win, he tried to steady his breath, forcing himself to think. It was a hopeless situation. There was no way to fight back physically, no way to overpower a police officer, especially one with so much authority. But maybe there was another way. Maybe there was a crack in the officer's control, a way to make him hesitate, even for just a moment. Marcus glanced at the rat again, its beady eyes locked onto his. Its twitching, frantic movements made his stomach lurch. Everything about this felt wrong, but as the officer stepped closer, he realized he was running out of time. He had to do something. "What are you waiting for?" Taylor barked. "Do it now, or I'll make you regret it." The officer's voice was venomous, and Marcus could see the cruelty behind his words. There was no empathy in Taylor's eyes, just a need to assert dominance, to break him. But Marcus wasn't ready to break. He couldn't be. He could hear the distant hum of a passing car, but it didn't sound like the usual street noise. It was heavier, closer. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be his dad? The thought hit him with unexpected urgency, but his mind was too fogged with fear to focus fully. No. It couldn't be him, it was just a car, probably some passerby unaware of what was happening. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step back. The officer didn't notice immediately, caught up in his own sadistic game. But when Marcus' movement caught his eye, the officer's face twisted with anger. "Don't move, kid," Officer Taylor snarled. Marcus froze, but his eyes shifted to the street behind the officer. A car, an SUV, dark and sleek, had slowed down and was now parked a few yards away. His pulse quickened. The car idled there for a moment, and for a split second, Marcus thought he saw a figure in the front seat, a man who looked strangely familiar, a man with an unmistakable air of authority. It couldn't be. It couldn't be his dad, but the sensation in his chest grew stronger. That was his father's car. Andrew's SUV was distinctive, he had bought it just a few years ago, and Marcus had always recognized the black exterior and tinted windows. And right now, as the tension between him and Officer Taylor reached its breaking point, he dared to hope, just for a second, that his father was closer than he thought. The officer, too focused on Marcus, didn't seem to notice the vehicle. He was watching the boy closely now, narrowing his eyes as if expecting Marcus to back down. There was something almost predatory in the way Taylor was staring at him, like a lion watching its prey before the final strike. Marcus swallowed hard. He needed to keep his cool. Stay calm. Don't give him what he wants. Is that your father's car? The officer asked suddenly, his voice turning more calculating. I bet he's not even here, is he? Probably doesn't care what happens to you. Marcus' throat tightened. The officer was baiting him, trying to provoke him into reacting. But Marcus knew better than to take the bait. He kept his gaze locked on the officer, refusing to show weakness. But in his mind, everything was shifting. His father was near. Somehow, he was near. And though Marcus had no idea how he had arrived so quickly, or why he wasn't here yet, he could feel the pull of safety, a lifeline that was just within reach. Officer Taylor wasn't done. You think he's going to come running when I'm done with you? He'll be just like all the rest. Another coward who doesn't care about his own kid. The words stung. The officer's cruelty was unforgiving. But Marcus felt something deep inside him stir. He wanted to prove the officer wrong. He wanted to show Taylor that his father wasn't like that he did care. Just as the officer took another step toward him, Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. It was close. So close. Taylor didn't seem to notice, too consumed by his twisted sense of control. But Marcus knew. He recognized that sound, the sound of a door shutting with purpose. It was his father. Marcus' heart raced in a way he couldn't control. This was it. Everything was about to change. The officer had no idea that Andrew was coming. He had no idea that he was standing on the edge of a storm that would destroy everything in its path. The officer's eyes flicked toward the door, distracted for a split second. Marcus saw the chance and seized it. In one swift motion, he moved to the side, his feet pounding the ground as he darted away from the officer. It wasn't a run, not yet, but it was enough to break the officer's focus for a moment. Hey! Officer Taylor shouted, charging after him. But the moment the officer turned, Marcus heard a voice that cut through the air like a whip. Taylor! The voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made the officer freeze in his tracks. Andrew. The moment the officer turned to face the voice, Marcus saw him. His father stood at the edge of the street, his expression unreadable. He was tall, with a quiet but undeniable presence, and his eyes locked onto Officer Taylor's with the kind of authority only someone who had spent years in law enforcement could command. And in that moment, Marcus felt a surge of relief. His father was here. Everything was about to change. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Marcus had never seen his father look this way before. His calm, controlled demeanor, usually the hallmark of a man who had seen it all, now radiated something far more intense. Andrew wasn't just standing there as a father, he was standing there as an agent, a man who had been trained to handle threats, who understood the balance of power, and who had seen what happens when that power is abused. And Officer Taylor had crossed that line. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. The world around them blurred, and it was just the three of them, Marcus, his father, and Officer Taylor, whose smug expression faltered when he recognized the figure standing before him. Taylor didn't know who Andrew was, not yet, but he felt the shift in the air. It was like a wave had crashed over him, and he was suddenly unsure of himself. He had been in control just a second ago, thinking he could break a scared kid. But now, with Andrew standing in front of him, he wasn't so sure. Marcus, still frozen where he stood, felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was his father. This was the man who, without saying a word, could change everything. But the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. Marcus wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. All he knew was that he was standing in the middle of a power struggle, and his father was about to enter a dangerous game, one that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to play. "Officer Taylor," Andrew said, his voice low, but with an unmistakable edge. There was no doubt in Marcus' mind now. His father was fully aware of the situation and ready to take charge. "You should have known better." Taylor's bravado cracked for a split second. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, a way out of the situation. But he had already gone too far. The moment he had forced Marcus to face that rat, the moment he had humiliated the boy in front of everyone, he had stepped into a world that wasn't his to control. It wasn't just a matter of breaking the rules, it was a matter of crossing a line that could have serious consequences. "What the hell is this?" Taylor spat, his hand twitching toward his belt. "Who the hell do you think you are, showing up here like this?" Andrew's gaze didn't shift. His eyes never left the officer's face as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I'm the last person you want to piss off." Taylor stiffened, his mouth pressing into a tight line. He didn't know how to react to the sudden shift in the balance of power. Marcus could see the sweat beginning to form on the officer's brow, could see his growing uncertainty. He had never seen his father like this before, so calm, so sure of himself in the face of someone who had just made a massive mistake. But there was more at play here than just this moment. Marcus could feel it, deep in his bones, the weight of his father's presence, the unseen history behind those words. Andrew wasn't just a parent. He wasn't just a man standing up for his son. He was someone who had lived a life filled with secrets, a life where people like Officer Taylor didn't just disappear when they stepped out of line. Andrew had connections. He had knowledge. He knew how to navigate the world of law enforcement in ways most people couldn't even begin to understand. The officer wasn't just dealing with a father protecting his son. He was dealing with an FBI agent, someone who knew how to handle situations like this, someone who wasn't afraid of the consequences. The officer didn't understand it yet, but he would soon. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but he knew that his father wasn't going to back down. The officer could feel it too. It was the way Andrew moved, the confidence in every step he took, the way he carried himself. Marcus' father was someone who had seen the worst of humanity and stood in the face of danger without blinking. But there was still the matter of the officer. Taylor was growing desperate now, his voice rising in frustration. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not gonna intimidate me, buddy. You're just some guy who thinks he can come in here and start making demands. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Andrew didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if he had already anticipated this response. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're the kind of person who hides behind a badge and thinks it gives you the right to do whatever you want. But it doesn't. You think you can make my son suffer, humiliate him in front of people, and there won't be consequences? You're wrong." Marcus' breath caught in his throat. He could see it now, the truth behind his father's words. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about something much larger, something far more dangerous. Andrew had never been the type to get involved in petty fights or arguments. But this was something he couldn't let slide. The officer, now visibly rattled, took a step back, his hands still hovering near his belt, as if ready to draw his weapon at any moment. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" Taylor hissed, his eyes flickering with a dangerous mix of fear and anger. "You have no idea who I know. You don't know what I'm capable of." Andrew didn't seem the least bit intimidated. "It's not about what you can do, officer. It's about what you've already done. And right now, you're digging yourself deeper into a hole you're not going to get out of." The tension between the two men was palpable. Marcus felt a surge of uncertainty. His father's words were calm, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something darker beneath them. Was his father really going to do something? Was he about to make this officer pay for what he had done? Before he could even process it, he heard the sound of another car door slamming, and this time, it wasn't distant. It was close. The street was eerily quiet for a second, and Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His father was already a force to be reckoned with, but this? This was something else entirely. Someone else was here. Someone Andrew had been waiting for. The officer's head snapped toward the sound, his hand instinctively pulling away from his belt. And that's when Marcus saw it, the unmistakable figure of a man stepping out of the second car. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden in shadow, but Marcus could already feel the aura of authority around him. Andrew hadn't been alone. The officer didn't stand a chance. He had no idea what he had just walked into. And Marcus? He was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath him shaking, his entire world shifting in ways he could never have imagined. The story was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. The man who stepped out of the second car moved with the same kind of purposeful confidence as Andrew, but there was something darker in the air around him. His posture was straight, his eyes scanning the scene with a practiced calm that sent a shiver down Marcus' spine. He wasn't just any ordinary man. He had an aura of control, of power, and he was here for a reason. The moment he stepped onto the street, it felt like the temperature dropped a few degrees. Marcus knew instantly that things were about to escalate, and that they weren't going to go in Officer Taylor's favor. Andrew's gaze shifted ever so slightly, acknowledging the newcomer without a word. It was clear to Marcus that this man wasn't just a random figure. This was someone his father trusted, someone who had a role to play in whatever was unfolding. The man didn't seem in a rush, though. He walked calmly, his every step deliberate as he closed the distance between himself and Officer Taylor. Taylor, who had been trying to regain some semblance of control, stiffened at the sight of the new arrival. His bravado cracked wide open, the confident defiance in his posture melting away as he realized the situation was no longer under his control. Marcus saw it in his eyes, he was calculating. But whatever he thought he could do, whatever threats he could muster, it was clear that he was out of his depth. His earlier words faltered, his chest rising and falling faster as his eyes flicked back and forth, weighing his options. The stranger stopped just a few feet from Officer Taylor, his gaze never wavering, his presence seemingly consuming the space around him. He was older than Andrew, perhaps in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair that was neatly combed back. His suit was dark, crisp, and fit perfectly. There was no sign of a badge or any insignia, but Marcus could sense he was part of something much larger than this moment, something that stretched far beyond the power dynamics of a mere police officer. Taylor, the man's voice was like a whisper that still managed to carry across the street. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding, the kind of voice that made people listen. "I think you've made a very serious mistake." Taylor stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his belt. The tension in the air was so thick that Marcus could practically feel it press against his chest. Taylor, who had been the one holding all the power just moments ago, now looked small, uncertain. It was like watching someone suddenly realize they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no way to escape. What is this?" Taylor stammered, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't just show up here and make threats. I'll have you arrested." The stranger cut him off with a raised hand, and just the gesture was enough to shut him down. "Do you honestly believe you can threaten me, officer? Or my associates?" The words hung in the air like a storm about to break, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of them, even as he stood frozen at the edge of the scene. Andrew's expression remained unreadable, but Marcus could tell he was letting the stranger take the lead. Whatever was happening, whatever this man was about to do, Andrew trusted him. And Marcus? He was caught between his father, the FBI agent, and the mystery man with all his power. A part of him wanted to pull away, to escape this unfolding storm. But he couldn't. Not when he was this close to the edge. "I'm not here for threats," the stranger continued, his tone icy. "I'm here to make sure you understand the gravity of what you've done. You're a police officer, Taylor. You should know better than anyone what happens when you cross certain lines. But clearly, you've forgotten. I'm here to remind you." Marcus watched Taylor's face drain of color. The officer, once so sure of himself, seemed to deflate in front of their eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice faltering, now entirely unsure. "I haven't done anything wrong." "This kid, the kid?" The stranger's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "This kid, as you call him, is someone you're about to regret ever even crossing paths with." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. His father's words, the ones he had overheard in their conversations, echoed in his mind. He had heard enough to know that Andrew had connections, people who worked in the shadows, far from the light of public view, people whose power extended beyond the reach of the law. But hearing those words from a stranger's mouth felt different. The man wasn't just talking about Marcus as some scared teenager, he was talking about something much bigger, something with far-reaching consequences. "Let me make something perfectly clear, officer," the stranger said, now turning his gaze fully toward Taylor. "I don't care who you think you are or who you've convinced yourself you are. I've seen men like you before. They think they can get away with anything because of their badge. But that's not how it works in this world. You don't make the rules here. You don't get to do whatever you want, especially when you've gone after the wrong people." Marcus stood motionless, unable to process everything that was happening. He was still struggling to understand who these people were, why they were here, and why they were talking about him, about his father, as if they were all caught in some larger game. Taylor, on the other hand, looked like he was suffocating. His face was ashen now, beads of sweat forming at his temples. The fear was evident in his eyes as he realized that he had gotten in over his head. He had no idea what was happening, but it was clear that whatever forces were at play here, they weren't in his control. "You need to leave. Right now," the stranger said quietly. "You've been given a chance. Don't waste it." Taylor took a step back, his whole body stiff. The last of his bravado was gone. He knew the words weren't a suggestion, they were a command. The officer glanced one last time at Marcus, his eyes filled with disbelief, before he turned and began to walk away. His every step was heavy, as though he were walking out of a nightmare he hadn't been prepared for. As Taylor hurried back toward his patrol car, the stranger's gaze never wavered, not even for a second. He stood there, silent, waiting until the officer was out of sight. Only then did he take a slow, deliberate breath and turned to face Andrew. "You should have warned him, Andrew," the stranger said, his voice still cold but tinged with something else, maybe a touch of regret. Andrew simply nodded. "I didn't think he'd be that stupid." The two men shared a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Marcus watched, trying to piece together everything he had just witnessed. His father wasn't just protecting him. He wasn't just here to ensure his safety. There was something much larger at play, something that Marcus couldn't yet grasp. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. The stranger had warned Taylor. He had given him a chance. But Marcus knew that whoever these people were, whatever power they wielded, the situation was far from resolved. If anything, it was only just beginning. As the distant hum of the patrol car faded into the background, Marcus felt an odd mix of relief and dread settle in his chest. Officer Taylor had left, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed to thicken, hanging like a cloud that wouldn't break. The stranger's presence loomed, heavy with the unspoken power that had shifted the entire dynamic in the blink of an eye. Andrew stood motionless for a moment, his eyes following the patrol car's tail lights until they disappeared down the road. Marcus didn't know what to say. What could he say? The fear and confusion still clung to him, but something else stirred beneath it all. Curiosity. And a quiet, unsettling understanding that the world he thought he knew was nothing like it seemed. His father, the man who had always been a figure of calm strength, was now standing in the aftermath of something that felt wrong, on a level he couldn't fully comprehend. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He simply stood by Andrew, his gaze focused ahead, as if waiting for something. But whatever he thought he could do, whatever threats he could muster, it was clear that he was out of his depth. His earlier words faltered, his chest rising and falling faster as his eyes flicked back and forth, weighing his options. The stranger stopped just a few feet from Officer Taylor, his gaze never wavering, his presence seemingly consuming the space around him. He was older than Andrew, perhaps in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair that was neatly combed back. His suit was dark, crisp, and fit perfectly. There was no sign of a badge or any insignia, but Marcus could sense he was part of something much larger than this moment, something that stretched far beyond the power dynamics of a mere police officer. Taylor, the man's voice was like a whisper that still managed to carry across the street. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding, the kind of voice that made people listen. "I think you've made a very serious mistake." Taylor stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his belt. The tension in the air was so thick that Marcus could practically feel it press against his chest. Taylor, who had been the one holding all the power just moments ago, now looked small, uncertain. It was like watching someone suddenly realize they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no way to escape. What is this?" Taylor stammered, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't just show up here and make threats. I'll have you arrested." The stranger cut him off with a raised hand, and just the gesture was enough to shut him down. "Do you honestly believe you can threaten me, officer? Or my associates?" The words hung in the air like a storm about to break, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of them, even as he stood frozen at the edge of the scene. Andrew's expression remained unreadable, but Marcus could tell he was letting the stranger take the lead. Whatever was happening, whatever this man was about to do, Andrew trusted him. And Marcus? He was caught between his father, the FBI agent, and the mystery man with all his power. A part of him wanted to pull away, to escape this unfolding storm. But he couldn't. Not when he was this close to the edge. "I'm not here for threats," the stranger continued, his tone icy. "I'm here to make sure you understand the gravity of what you've done. You're a police officer, Taylor. You should know better than anyone what happens when you cross certain lines. But clearly, you've forgotten. I'm here to remind you." Marcus watched Taylor's face drain of color. The officer, once so sure of himself, seemed to deflate in front of their eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice faltering, now entirely unsure. "I haven't done anything wrong. This kid, the kid?" The stranger's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "This kid, as you call him, is someone you're about to regret ever even crossing paths with." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. His father's words, the ones he had overheard in their conversations, echoed in his mind. He had heard enough to know that Andrew had connections, people who worked in the shadows, far from the light of public view, people whose power extended beyond the reach of the law. But hearing those words from a stranger's mouth felt different. The man wasn't just talking about Marcus as some scared teenager, he was talking about something much bigger, something with far-reaching consequences. "Let me make something perfectly clear, officer," the stranger said, now turning his gaze fully toward Taylor. "I don't care who you think you are or who you've convinced yourself you are. I've seen men like you before. They think they can get away with anything because of their badge. But that's not how it works in this world. You don't make the rules here. You don't get to do whatever you want, especially when you've gone after the wrong people." Marcus stood motionless, unable to process everything that was happening. He was still struggling to understand who these people were, why they were here, and why they were talking about him, about his father, as if they were all caught in some larger game. Taylor, on the other hand, looked like he was suffocating. His face was ashen now, beads of sweat forming at his temples. The fear was evident in his eyes as he realized that he had gotten in over his head. He had no idea what was happening, but it was clear that whatever forces were at play here, they weren't in his control. "You need to leave. Right now," the stranger said quietly. "You've been given a chance. Don't waste it." Taylor took a step back, his whole body stiff. The last of his bravado was gone. He knew the words weren't a suggestion, they were a command. The officer glanced one last time at Marcus, his eyes filled with disbelief, before he turned and began to walk away. His every step was heavy, as though he were walking out of a nightmare he hadn't been prepared for. As Taylor hurried back toward his patrol car, the stranger's gaze never wavered, not even for a second. He stood there, silent, waiting until the officer was out of sight. Only then did he take a slow, deliberate breath and turn to face Andrew. "You should have warned him, Andrew," the stranger said, his voice still cold but tinged with something else, maybe a touch of regret. Andrew simply nodded. "I didn't think he'd be that stupid." The two men shared a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Marcus watched, trying to piece together everything he had just witnessed. His father wasn't just protecting him. He wasn't just here to ensure his safety. There was something much larger at play, something that Marcus couldn't yet grasp. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. The stranger had warned Taylor. He had given him a chance. But Marcus knew that whoever these people were, whatever power they wielded, the situation was far from resolved. If anything, it was only just beginning. As the distant hum of the patrol car faded into the background, Marcus felt an odd mix of relief and dread settle in his chest. Officer Taylor had left, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed to thicken, hanging like a cloud that wouldn't break. The stranger's presence loomed, heavy with the unspoken power that had shifted the entire dynamic in the blink of an eye. Andrew stood motionless for a moment, his eyes following the patrol car's tail lights until they disappeared down the road. Marcus didn't know what to say. What could he say? The fear and confusion still clung to him, but something else stirred beneath it all. Curiosity. And a quiet, unsettling understanding that the world he thought he knew was nothing like it seemed. His father, the man who had always been a figure of calm strength, was now standing in the aftermath of something that felt wrong, on a level he couldn't fully comprehend. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He simply stood by Andrew, his gaze focused ahead, as if waiting for something. There was no rush, no urgency. But Marcus knew, deep down, that everything, every word, every action from this point forward, mattered. The stakes were too high for any of this to be random or insignificant. Finally, Andrew turned toward Marcus, his face unreadable but his eyes filled with that quiet understanding that only a parent could give. "You're all right?" he asked softly, the first words he had spoken directly to Marcus since this whole nightmare began. Marcus nodded quickly, even though his insides were still churning. "Yeah. I'm fine," he lied, not even sure if he was trying to convince his father or himself. "What's going on? Who was that guy?" Andrew didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the stranger, whose eyes flicked over to Marcus, a brief but intense exchange passing between them. There was something calculated in the man's gaze, something that seemed to say, "This isn't over." The way his eyes lingered on Marcus for just a fraction of a second made his skin prickle with unease. "We need to go," the stranger said at last, his voice steady and firm, though Marcus could hear the undercurrent of urgency in it now. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. "There's no time." Andrew didn't hesitate. He gave Marcus a long, measuring look, one that told him everything had changed. Everything had always been different, but now, in this moment, it felt as if the world Marcus thought he knew had been ripped apart. His father was making decisions, choices, that Marcus didn't fully understand, but he could see the weight of them, the responsibility hanging on Andrew's shoulders. Without another word, the two men began to walk toward the car, the stranger a step behind Andrew. Marcus followed instinctively, his legs moving almost on their own, though every part of him screamed to ask more questions, to demand answers. What was going on? The car wasn't far, parked just down the street, its black exterior gleaming under the dim streetlight. Marcus slid into the back seat, the leather seat cold against his skin, and for the first time that night, the silence felt suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with something Marcus couldn't grasp, but he knew it wasn't just the tension from the officer. There was something deeper at play here, something that went beyond this street, beyond this night. As the stranger got in the front passenger seat and the engine rumbled to life, Marcus glanced over at his father. Andrew's eyes were focused on the road ahead, his grip on the wheel tight. His jaw was clenched, but Marcus could see that his mind was elsewhere, calculating, strategizing, preparing for something. "So, what now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break the silence that had filled the car like a wall. Andrew's eyes flicked to him for just a moment before he answered, his voice low. "You'll be safe. That's all you need to know right now." The answer wasn't satisfying. It was cryptic, but Marcus could sense the finality in his father's tone. Whatever this was, it wasn't something Marcus could control. It wasn't something he could fix. The car sped through the streets, the city lights flickering by in a blur as they left the neighborhood behind. The tension was growing again, a pressure that Marcus could feel pushing down on him. The further they drove, the more he began to realize that whatever danger was out there, it was much closer than he had thought. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his father, and whatever this stranger had been sent to do. The stranger remained quiet for the duration of the drive, his eyes scanning the street ahead as if he were searching for something, or waiting for something to happen. Marcus could feel his gaze, always present, always assessing, and it only made him more uneasy. He didn't know who this man was or why he had been brought into the situation, but he had an instinctive feeling that he wasn't just here to help. He was here to protect his own interests. They finally turned onto a quieter street, one Marcus didn't recognize, and the car slowed. Andrew looked over at the stranger, his voice just barely audible as he said, "Are you sure this is the place?" The stranger didn't answer immediately, but his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Marcus for the briefest of moments. Then he nodded once. "It's the only place we can go now." Marcus' heart skipped. "The only place we can go now," the words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. What was happening? What had his father gotten them into? And who was this man that had come from the shadows to pull them into it? He wasn't just an agent, there was something else beneath the surface. Something darker. The car came to a stop in front of an old warehouse, its windows boarded up and its doors rusted. It looked abandoned, desolate, like a place no one should want to be. The atmosphere around it was thick, foreboding. Marcus felt his stomach churn, his nerves fraying as he stared at the building. This was no ordinary place. This wasn't just a stop on the way to safety. This was where everything would come to a head. Andrew turned to him, his expression hard, unreadable. "Stay close," he said, the weight of his words making it clear this was no time to question him. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than any of them. The climax was coming, and they were walking straight into it. Marcus didn't have a choice. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever was about to unfold, but he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The car's engine cut off with a finality that seemed to echo in the silent air. Marcus' pulse quickened as the dim glow of the streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the desolate warehouse. The place felt abandoned, as if it hadn't seen any human activity in years. It wasn't just the warehouse itself, but the whole street. It was empty, eerily quiet, as if the world outside had vanished. Andrew didn't wait for Marcus to ask any more questions. He opened the door, stepping out of the car with a smooth but purposeful motion. The stranger, who had remained silent during the drive, followed quickly, his steps heavy, measured, almost too deliberate. Marcus hesitated for a moment, staring at the darkened building, his stomach a twisted knot of anxiety. "Come on," Andrew's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that told Marcus this wasn't a moment to hesitate. There was no room for fear now, no room for second-guessing. He stepped out of the car, his feet scraping against the gravel, every movement feeling like it was happening in slow motion. His hands shook slightly, though he tried to hide it by stuffing them into his jacket pockets. He followed his father toward the warehouse, each step taking them deeper into a world Marcus barely understood. Whatever had been happening around them that night was only the tip of the iceberg, and he knew that now. As they reached the entrance, the stranger moved ahead, pulling the large, rusted key from his pocket and unlocking the heavy steel door. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit interior. It smelled of dust and decay, the air thick with the weight of forgotten years. Marcus could barely make out the shapes in the shadows, his eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. It looked like nothing more than a forgotten storage space, empty crates, old machinery covered in layers of dust. But something about the place made his skin crawl. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet tension, like everything in this room was waiting for something. The stranger stepped inside first, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Andrew followed immediately, and Marcus, feeling the weight of his father's hand briefly rest on his back, followed close behind. They walked further into the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick, dusty floor. The deeper they went, the more Marcus' heart raced. There were people here, he could feel it. Not just the stranger and his father. There were others, hidden in the dark corners, their presence lingering like a whisper just beyond his reach. Andrew stopped suddenly, his posture shifting. He was on alert now, his eyes scanning the room as he stood still, like a predator waiting for something to happen. Marcus could feel the shift, the change in his father's energy. It was subtle, but it was there. This wasn't the man who had tried to comfort him earlier. This was someone else, someone hardened, prepared for whatever was about to unfold. "Stay close, Marcus," Andrew muttered under his breath, his voice low and intense. "Don't move." Marcus nodded, his eyes darting around the dimly lit warehouse. His skin prickled as he noticed the shadowed figures around them. They weren't moving, at least not yet, but they were there, silent and watchful. Then, without warning, a door on the far side of the room creaked open, and a figure stepped through, silhouetted by the weak light from behind. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just anyone. The man who emerged was tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of command that was impossible to ignore. His face was obscured by a dark mask, but the way he carried himself told Marcus everything he needed to know. This was someone important. Someone dangerous. Someone who was tied to whatever was unfolding in the shadows of this place. The stranger who had brought them here, Marcus had never gotten his name, stepped forward, greeting the newcomer with a simple nod. "It's time." The masked man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Andrew, studying him carefully, before his eyes fell on Marcus. The moment their gazes met, Marcus felt an ice-cold shiver race down his spine. There was something about the way the man looked at him, almost as if he were weighing him, judging him. It was like his very presence was a threat, an unspoken warning that whatever was happening here, whatever this meeting was not something Marcus was supposed to be a part of. But it was too late for that. He was already here, already entangled in whatever this world was. He could feel it tightening around him like a noose. "Is he ready?" The masked man's voice was deep, gruff, barely audible in the cavernous space. Andrew didn't flinch at the question, though Marcus could see the tension in his father's jaw. "He'll be ready," Andrew said, his voice unwavering. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, as though he was considering his next move carefully. The masked man took a step closer to Marcus, his presence overwhelming. "He doesn't have much time left," the man said, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "You need to understand what's at stake here, Agent. We can't afford delays." Andrew didn't back down. "I'm not here for your games," he said. "I'm here to ensure my son is safe." The masked man's eyes flicked briefly to Marcus again, the same calculating look in them. "Then you'll understand what needs to be done." Marcus felt like he was suffocating under the weight of their words. He had no idea what they were talking about, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't a simple mission. This wasn't just about keeping him safe. There was something much more complex, more dangerous, unfolding in the shadows around them. Whatever his father had been involved in, whatever this group was, it wasn't something he could easily escape. The masked man turned and motioned to the far corner of the warehouse. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice cold and stern. "Move." Andrew didn't hesitate. He motioned for Marcus to follow, and the three of them walked toward the far side of the room. The other figures who had been watching silently from the shadows moved aside as they approached, giving way to something, or someone, waiting in the dimly lit corner. Marcus could barely make out the shape of a tall, metal table in the middle of the space. On it, there was something covered by a tarp. As they drew closer, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Whatever it wasn't meant to be seen, at least not by him. But before he could ask any more questions, the masked man stepped forward, his voice low and ominous. "It's time for you to understand the truth, Marcus. This is bigger than you could ever imagine." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling in. Marcus was about to ask what that meant when suddenly, a loud noise shattered the stillness, followed by a series of rapid footsteps. Everything shifted. The tension, the air, the room, it was like a pressure valve had been released, and Marcus could feel it all around him. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty warehouse as if it were an ominous warning. The tension in the room thickened, and Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but every answer only led to more questions. He tried to look around for any clue, any explanation, but the shadows around them seemed to move with a mind of their own, adding to the confusion. The masked man, who had been standing with his arms crossed, suddenly snapped his head toward the source of the noise. His body tensed, his eyes narrowing. "Stay back," he growled to the other figures in the shadows, his voice dangerously low. Before anyone could react, the door at the far end of the warehouse crashed open with a force that shook the building. A burst of light flooded in from the outside, blinding everyone for a moment. Then, two figures stepped into the room, their silhouettes sharp against the light. They were wearing black tactical gear, their faces covered, and they moved with military precision. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize them, but there was no mistaking the menace in their posture. The stranger, the masked man, tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for something at his side. Andrew, who had been calm and collected just moments before, now stood completely still, his eyes darting between the two newcomers. "Who are they?" Marcus whispered, but Andrew didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze flicked toward the stranger in a way that made Marcus' stomach churn. The newcomers were armed. Guns, strapped to their hips, and the kind of attitude that only came from people who had been in dangerous situations before. They weren't here for a casual conversation. "I should have known," the stranger muttered under his breath, almost to himself. His voice was laced with frustration, but there was an edge of fear too, something Marcus had never heard in his voice before. It made the air around them feel even colder. "Backup arrived," one of the newcomers said, his voice calm but firm, as he stepped further into the room. "We have orders to bring the boy in." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. "Bring the boy in," he repeated, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What do you mean? What do you want with me?" Andrew stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in immediately. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his tone deadly serious. The two figures didn't flinch, but their eyes were locked on Marcus. They weren't here for Andrew, at least not yet. They had come for him. "What is this about? What do you want from my son?" Andrew's voice was a low growl now, one that sent a chill down Marcus' spine. He had never heard his father like this before. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a man who was completely unhinged. But it wasn't fear, it was something worse. A desperation that Marcus didn't understand. One of the newcomers glanced at the masked man, who was still standing stiffly in the corner. The figure finally spoke, his voice almost too soft, like he didn't want to alert anyone around them. "He doesn't know, does he?" Marcus felt a pit open in his stomach. "What?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" The room seemed to close in around him, his breath coming quicker, shallow now. Andrew's eyes were now locked with the newcomers. It was obvious that there was something huge, something dangerous, hanging between them, but Marcus had no idea what it was. "Marcus," Andrew finally said, his voice much softer than before, but filled with a warning. "You need to listen to me." But before Andrew could continue, the figure who had spoken stepped closer to Marcus. He was tall, and his eyes were cold, almost unfeeling. "Do you know who you really are?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't know what the man meant. He didn't know what was going on or why they were all looking at him this way, but he felt an overwhelming sense that whatever it was about to change everything. The other figure, his partner, took a step forward. "We've waited too long for this," he said, his voice low but certain. "Time's up." At that moment, the weight of their words began to sink in, slowly and then all at once. Marcus had no idea what they were talking about, but the desperation in his father's eyes told him everything. This wasn't just about a simple threat. These men weren't random agents, they were something else, something more dangerous. Marcus' pulse raced as he finally managed to speak. "What do you mean? I don't know. What am I supposed to know?" His voice cracked, but it didn't matter. No one seemed to be listening. One of the newcomers reached out, his hand moving towards Marcus in a swift motion, and instinctively, Marcus took a step back. The tension was unbearable. But before anything could happen, Andrew lunged forward, placing himself between his son and the intruders. "No one touches him," Andrew spat, his voice sharp, commanding. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Marcus had never seen his father like this. He wasn't just protecting him. He was warning them. But just as Andrew seemed poised to take action, the masked man moved swiftly, his hand flying to his side as he pulled out a gun. The tension that had been building up in the room reached its peak, and Marcus could feel his entire body frozen in place. What had they just walked into? What did his father get them involved in? And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything changed. The masked man turned on Andrew, his gun now aimed directly at him. "I'm sorry, Andrew. This is bigger than you. Bigger than anything you've ever been a part of." Marcus felt his chest tighten as the cold realization hit him like a slap across the face. His father wasn't the person he thought he was. The world they were in, this hidden world of agents and secrets and danger, was far deeper than Marcus had ever imagined. "Don't!" Marcus cried out, but his voice was drowned by the deafening sound of the gunshot that rang out, slicing through the silence and sending the room into chaos. Marcus' world seemed to shatter in an instant. He couldn't process what had just happened. His father, the person who had always been the unshakable foundation of his life, was now down on the ground. And the masked man, the one who had always been the source of so many unanswered questions, was standing over him. The newcomers seemed unfazed, and the tension in the room only grew thicker. The stakes had never been higher, and the true nature of their danger was only beginning to reveal itself. The question now was clear: who could Marcus trust in this world that seemed to be built on lies and betrayal? The world around Marcus spun as he stood frozen, his father lying on the ground, blood staining the cold, dusty floor beneath him. He could hardly process what had just happened. The loud echo of the gunshots still rang in his ears, the deafening sound slowly fading into a blur of confusion. The masked man stood over Andrew's motionless form, the gun still aimed at his father's chest, but the tension in his stance seemed to waver. The coldness in his eyes never left, but there was a flicker of something else, hesitation, perhaps. Marcus' heart raced, every instinct in his body screaming to run, to escape, to make sure that this moment wasn't the end. But his legs refused to move. His eyes were glued to the scene before him, trying to understand the chaos that had just unfolded. "Get up," the masked man finally spoke, his voice cold and calculated, the gun still directed at Andrew. "You've made your choice. Now you deal with the consequences." Andrew didn't move. He didn't even flinch. There was a stillness about him now, an eerie calm despite the blood slowly spreading beneath him. Marcus felt his throat tighten, his chest constricting with panic. Was his father? Was he dead? Why? Marcus managed to croak, his voice breaking as he took a step forward, his feet shaky on the ground. "What did he do? Why are you doing this?" The masked man didn't answer at first. His eyes flickered over to the other two figures standing behind Marcus, their presence looming like shadows. He took a step back, lowering the gun just slightly. "You don't know anything, kid," the man said. "You don't understand who your father really is, or what he's done." Marcus swallowed hard, every word from the man hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Who is he?" Marcus whispered. "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" His voice broke, a mix of anger and confusion rising in him. Andrew's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Marcus felt his knees weaken as a wave of helplessness crashed over him. His father, the person who had always been his protector, the one who had kept him safe from everything, had been lying to him all along. The truth was finally starting to come to the surface, and it was so much worse than Marcus could have ever imagined. The masked man stepped closer to Marcus, his boots thudding on the floor with each step. "You're about to learn a hard lesson, kid," he said, his tone low and mocking. "Nothing in this world is what it seems. Your father made a deal, a dangerous deal, and now, it's time for him to pay the price. And you, well, you're just a part of the game now. You're tied to it whether you like it or not." Marcus' blood ran cold. What did that mean? What kind of deal had his father made? What had he gotten them involved in? The newcomer, who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward, his hand reaching into his coat. "It's time we gave him the truth," he said to the masked man, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "He needs to know the full story." The masked man nodded, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "You want the truth, kid?" he asked, his voice colder than before. "You think your father's been a hero? That he's been working to protect you?" "No. He's been running a game of his own, one that's caught up with him now. And it's going to cost him everything. Including you." Marcus' mind reeled. He had always known his father was involved in something bigger, something dangerous. But this? This was a nightmare. The people who had walked into their lives weren't just any criminals, they were part of something far more sinister. Something that made all the other secrets Andrew had kept seem like small lies in comparison. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing against his chest. He could barely breathe, let alone understand the implications of what he was being told. Was his father a criminal? Had he been lying to Marcus his whole life? Suddenly, another voice cut through the air, this one coming from a far corner of the warehouse. It was a voice Marcus didn't recognize, but the tone was familiar. Soft, authoritative, yet somehow menacing. "You're wrong," the voice said, echoing off the metal walls, sending a shiver down Marcus' spine. The masked man's eyes snapped to the corner. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his posture tensing. "We have business to finish." Out of the shadows stepped another figure, his presence commanding and yet unnervingly calm. He wore a suit, dark and immaculate, and despite the chaos around them, there was something about him that made Marcus feel like this person was the real authority in the room. A new layer of fear settled over Marcus. Who was this person, and why did he suddenly feel like the stakes had just been raised even higher? The newcomer raised a hand, signaling for the masked man to lower his weapon. "It's time to stop this madness," the suited figure said. His eyes were fixed on the masked man. "The deal is over. This boy, Marcus, he's not part of this. Not anymore." The tension in the room grew thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. Marcus couldn't tell if this new person was an ally or an enemy, but something about his presence made the masked man hesitate. For the first time, the gun lowered, and the room seemed to exhale in collective relief, though no one dared to speak. The suited man turned to Marcus, his eyes briefly flicking over to Andrew's still form. "I understand your confusion, but I need you to listen carefully. Your father didn't choose this path lightly. He's been fighting a war you don't know about. A war between forces much bigger than anyone understands." And now, he trailed off, letting the words hang in the air. Marcus' breath caught. "Now what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if the weight of the question might crush him. The suited man took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Now, you're caught in the middle. And we need you to choose a side." The words hit Marcus like a blow to the chest. Choose a side? What was he talking about? What kind of war was his father really involved in? And why had they brought Marcus into it? The mask of uncertainty fell from the suited man's face, and the cold reality of the situation sunk in. "There's no going back from this," he said quietly. "This is the moment that changes everything. For you, for your father, and for the world you thought you knew." Before Marcus could respond, there was another sound, an explosion from deep within the warehouse, shaking the ground beneath their feet and knocking everyone off balance. The masked man spun around, his gun drawn in an instant. Marcus barely had time to register what was happening before the room erupted into chaos once again, the sudden shift in the air pulling him back into the whirlwind of secrets, lies, and decisions that would shape his future. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding his father's past, his own role in the dangerous game being played around him, and ultimately, whether Marcus could make it out alive. The explosion reverberated through the warehouse, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. Marcus stumbled, his heart racing as the noise rattled his bones. His mind was reeling, the weight of the last few moments crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He could barely make sense of anything anymore. The suited man, who had been speaking so calmly just moments before, spun toward the blast site. His eyes narrowed with calculated precision. The masked man beside him, still gripping his weapon, didn't hesitate either. They had both been trained for this kind of chaos. But Marcus, he wasn't trained for anything. Not for this. Not for the world of deceit and danger his father had dragged him into. His father, who was still lying motionless on the ground, blood staining the cold concrete. Every part of Marcus wanted to run, to flee from the nightmare that had overtaken his life. But his feet felt glued to the spot, unable to move. "We have to move," the suited man barked, his voice sharp, authoritative. "Now." "They're coming." The masked man nodded, his eyes never leaving the shadows in the far corner of the warehouse. "We need to get him out of here," he said, gesturing toward Andrew's body. But before either of them could make a move, the figure in the corner, the one who had appeared before the explosion, stepped forward once again. "No," the newcomer said, his voice colder than ever. "Leave him. This is bigger than him now. This is about the boy." The tension in the air was unbearable. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. His father's past, his own role in this twisted game, it all came rushing to the forefront of his mind. The explosion wasn't just some random act of violence. It was a warning. A signal. Someone was making their move. "Tell me what's going on," Marcus said, his voice trembling but filled with a quiet desperation. "Who are you? Who's coming after me?" The suited man turned toward him, his gaze softening just for a moment. "They're coming for the information your father stole," he said quietly. "For the people he's betrayed. And for you, Marcus. You're the key." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. The key? The key to what? What had his father gotten involved in? What kind of information was so important that it was worth all this violence? Before Marcus could ask another question, the far wall of the warehouse was suddenly breached. Another explosion shook the foundation of the building, the force of it rattling every window in the space. Figures clad in black, armed to the teeth, rushed through the hole, their guns drawn, their movements precise. Marcus barely had time to process what was happening before the room was flooded with armed men. "Move now," the suited man commanded, pulling Marcus by the arm, dragging him away from the chaos. But Marcus couldn't move. He stood frozen in place, staring at the carnage around him, the twisted faces of enemies, the gunfire, the sounds of struggle filling the air. He couldn't look away from his father's still form on the floor, the blood spreading further, his world crumbling around him. It was then that the final twist came, a revelation so sharp and unexpected that Marcus felt the ground slip from beneath him. The masked man, the one who had been so cold and calculating, turned toward Marcus, his face finally visible. The hood had fallen back, revealing a familiar face, one that sent a chill through Marcus's entire being. It was his own uncle. "Uncle?" Marcus choked out, disbelief coursing through his veins. What is going on?" The man, his uncle, looked at him with a cold expression, no hint of the warmth that Marcus had once known. "I didn't want it to come to this, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with a quiet regret. "But your father made a choice. He put you in this position. And now, you're a target. They won't stop until they have what they want. Until they have you." Marcus stumbled back, his mind reeling from the shock. His uncle? A part of all this? He had trusted him, known him as a safe harbor in his life. Now, all of that was shattered. His family, the people he had counted on, were all entangled in this deadly web. I don't understand, Marcus whispered. What did Dad do? His uncle's gaze flicked to the suited man, who had been watching the scene unfold silently. The suited man spoke up, his voice steady and final. Your father was a double agent. He infiltrated a syndicate, the same one that's after you now. He betrayed them, and they'll stop at nothing to take him down. They've been after the information he stole, the connections he made. Marcus's head spun, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. A double agent? His father? He had always believed his father to be a simple man, someone who kept them safe, someone who loved him. But now it was clear that Andrew had lived a secret life, one filled with lies, espionage, and betrayal. And you, Marcus, his uncle continued, his voice harder now, you're the one who holds the final piece of the puzzle. The information your father took, the plans he uncovered. It's all in your hands now. Wait, Marcus said, his mind racing. What do you mean? I don't know anything about any of this. I don't have anything. But the suited man shook his head. It's in your blood, Marcus. You're more than you realize. The people coming for you, they know who you are. They know what you can do. And they'll do anything to control you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus felt his breath catch, his hands trembling. He was in over his head, there was no escaping it now. His father was gone, and whatever dangerous game had been set in motion was coming for him. Suddenly, the door to the warehouse exploded open, revealing another figure. A woman. She was wearing a tactical suit, her face hidden behind a mask, but there was something about her presence that felt different from the others. She was no mere soldier, there was something more deliberate in her movements, something that made Marcus's blood run cold. Marcus, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a sharp blade. We've been waiting for you. Before he could process her words, the suited man stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of warning. No, he said. Not yet. It's not the time. But Marcus knew, deep in his gut, that this was it. The final moment had arrived. His life, the life he thought he knew, was over. The storm that had been gathering for so long had finally broken. And in the end, there was no escape from the dark web his father had tangled him in. The woman in the mask smiled, a chilling, calculating smile that sent shivers down Marcus's spine. We'll see about that, she said softly, before the room descended into chaos once more. And Marcus, now trapped between enemies and allies, realized that he was no longer just a pawn in the game. He was the game itself. And nothing would ever be the same again. The chaos in the warehouse exploded around Marcus, and everything he had once known about his life, his family, and his world was now shattered. He could hear the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and rushing footsteps as the masked woman moved closer to him, her movements calculated and precise. She was no longer just a figure in the shadows, she was a tangible threat, someone with purpose, someone who held the answers he desperately needed. Marcus stood frozen, his mind still racing with the impossible revelations of the last few hours. His father, a double agent. His uncle, part of this world of secrets and violence. And now, this woman, who was she? What was happening to him? The suited man, who had been guiding them through the storm up until now, stepped forward. His face was calm, almost eerily so, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't part of the plan. Whatever was happening now, it wasn't what they had prepared for. Who is she? Marcus demanded, his voice rising with desperation. The woman smiled, her mask reflecting the light. It was a strange, chilling smile, one that made Marcus's blood run cold. "You don't need to know everything just yet, Marcus," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But you will. Soon enough." Before Marcus could respond, the suited man raised a hand, his face darkening. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered to himself, more to his own thoughts than anyone else. Then, turning to Marcus, he added, "They knew. They've always known where you were. They've been waiting for this moment." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding his place in a larger game, a game where he had no control, where every choice he made felt like a move on a chessboard. And now, he was standing in the middle of it all, tangled in a web of lies and betrayal. The suited man looked over at the woman once more, his eyes narrowing. "You don't need to do this," he said. "The boy is just a kid. He doesn't know anything." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to Marcus, her gaze unwavering. "That's where you're wrong," she said softly, her words laced with a dark finality. "He knows more than you think." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I'm just a..." But he couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of the truth was too much. Everything that had happened over the past few hours, his father's death, the revelations about the people chasing them, his own involvement, had led him to this moment. The woman reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. "It's time to make a choice," she said, her voice no longer cold. But something softer, almost sympathetic. "Your father might be gone, but you're still part of this. And now, you have to decide which side you'll take." Marcus's mind reeled. His father was dead. His uncle was part of the game. The suited man, despite his apparent empathy, was involved in all of this too. Everyone around him had been lying, keeping secrets, manipulating him, keeping him in the dark. How was he supposed to choose? "What side?" he asked, his voice cracking as he struggled to make sense of it all. "How can I choose? I don't even know what's going on. All I want is to go home. I don't want any part of this." The woman's eyes softened for a brief moment, as if she understood the weight of his words. But then she straightened, her face hardening once more. "You don't get to go home, Marcus. Not anymore. This is who you are now. This is your reality. You're not just some innocent kid anymore. You've been pulled into something bigger than you." Suddenly, everything clicked. The pieces fell into place like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing the bigger picture. Marcus had been running from this truth his entire life. But now, there was no escaping it. His father's legacy, his involvement in this world of crime and espionage, was something that would define him whether he liked it or not. The very people who had manipulated him were now looking to use him as a pawn in their deadly game. The suited man, watching the scene unfold, nodded slowly. "She's right, Marcus," he said quietly. "You're not just a bystander in all of this. You're part of it. You always have been." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the distant sound of gunfire and the occasional crash as the fight outside continued. Marcus stood still, his mind whirling with thoughts he could hardly process. He wanted to run, to escape, to return to the life he had known. But deep down, he knew that life was gone. It had been gone the moment his father had made his fateful choices. "So what now?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. The woman looked at him, her eyes calculating. "Now, we end this," she said, her tone final. "Now, you decide how the story ends. You can fight with us, or against us. But you have to choose. Because the people coming after you won't stop. They'll do anything to get what they want. And the clock is ticking." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for control, for power. His life, his future, was hanging in the balance. And with one final, impossible choice, Marcus would have to decide what kind of person he was going to be. He looked at the people standing around him, the faces that had once been familiar to him, his uncle, the suited man, the woman, and realized that they weren't who he had thought they were. They were players in a game of shadows, a game that had been set into motion long before Marcus had even known the rules. "I don't want to be part of this anymore," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "But I'm not going to let them win." The suited man nodded, a look of respect passing between them. "Good choice," he said. "You're stronger than you think. And you'll need that strength, because the battle's far from over." And just as Marcus braced himself for the next phase of this twisted game, a final explosion shook the building, sending everyone into a frenzy. The walls cracked, the roof above them groaned with the pressure of the blast, and in that moment, Marcus realized something: there was no escaping the past. There was only moving forward. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Marcus stood tall, no longer the boy who had stumbled into a nightmare, but a young man who had just begun to understand the weight of the choices he would have to make. The world around him was still in chaos, but for the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of hope in his heart. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone control him anymore. He would take back his life. And he would find out who was truly behind all of this. The game had only just begun, but Marcus was ready to play. And in the end, it would be his turn to make the rules.